We in Latvia also very much stick to German habits. We try to be very precisely at the point. So, and since the discussion has to start at 1 o'clock, I think we could really start discussing very important business strategic autonomy. And it's my great pleasure to open another one event which is devoted to this topic, because Latvian Transatlantic organization, together with its partners, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Defense, initiated a range of different discussions which could be devoted to European security, and strategic autonomy is one of the topics starting from 2016, and most probably even onwards, so the discussion will continue. Today we are having 4 excellent speakers. We will start with Mr. Gurvan, who is Deputy Director of the TAPS at the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. Then I will give floor to Claudia Mayor. At the beginning, we wanted a little bit different type of scenario, but Claudia has to leave earlier, so therefore I will give her floor as the second speaker. And Claudia Mayor is the head of the International Security Division at the SAP. Sicherung and Wissenschaft Politik Institute in Germany. Then the discussion will be followed by Yves, Emeritus Professor Ecole Polytechnique, and he is also Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research. And the discussion will be wrapped up by Jana Puglierin, who is Senior Policy Fellow at European Council of Foreign Relations, and also she's the head of ECFR Berlin office. We will start with a very short 7 minutes introduction on your perspective on strategic autonomy, and the discussion will be launched after presentations. There is only one special case. Again, since Claudia has to leave, then I will invite participants, if they have any urgent questions they would like to address to Claudia, then we could take 2 or 3 questions before she leaves. And then we will proceed in already in announced order. Each speaker has 7 minutes. Claudia's case, you can a little bit go for 10 minutes again because of your special arrangement. And after those short presentations, we will continue on the discussion mode. Just a short introduction. We had the first discussion on strategic autonomy, which was mostly discussing Latvian and European perspectives. Then we had an open lecture and discussion on the European Strategic Compass, which is now very much debated in Brussels. But then it was definitely a need, an urgent need, and justified need to listen also voices from France and Germany. So therefore, this discussion is about French and German perspective with the touch of European perspective, which will be presented in the end by Jana. And this discussion will be moderated by me, Žaneta Ozoliņa, and I'm chair of the board of the Latvian Transatlantic organization. So without any further ado, I would like to give floor to Mr. Lebras. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Žaneta. Thank you. Good morning to you all. I hope you're hearing me fine. My name is Gurvan Lebras. I'm the deputy head of the policy planning in the French Foreign Ministry. So I'm very glad to be here with you to be able to give you some hints to the French perception of what strategic autonomy is, although not an official perspective, because here in the policy planning we have the freedom to be able to give a flavor of what the state of play of the different challenges we discuss within the ministry, but with more liberty and than the official the officials that will have to stick to the common and agreed language. So On this, I think what's interesting too for me as a policy planner is that strategic autonomy, of course, has been an issue that on which we've been working in the policy planning for many years, and of course there has been some actuality in this concept right now, and there is too, of course, a strong actuality now. Since I don't want to enter into a lengthy consideration on this, and I hope you're not too afraid by the fact that I said that we've been working on this for long. I mean, it doesn't mean that I am going to be long. I hope I will stay short. I'd like to maybe make 3 points. The first, strategic autonomy as a term in itself, what it is, how should we handle it, how should we call it. My second point would be strategic autonomy as a diagnosis. Why is it important, and why does it come as a necessity in our view right now for Europe? And third, strategic autonomy in context, which is how we can handle it in the context that is the global geopolitical context that we have. So a term, I think my main message would be very simple. In Paris today, the term by which you would call what we are pursuing through a strategic autonomy is not really important. Whether you call it strategic autonomy, or you call it European sovereignty, or you call it Handlungsfähigkeit, like the German would do, it's not really important to us. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean exactly the same thing, but the terms themselves will have very different connotation and perception in the different countries. So each time you try to clarify the debate on the term, you only bring more confusion, and because people don't speak of exactly the same thing. So sovereignty in France is ambiguous. I think it's less positive than it could be in Germany, for example, whereas autonomy is very positive to us because it means freedom to act. But in Germany, for example, it would immediately imply distance from the partner and distance in the partnerships. So we're not into the business of trying to impose, or not necessarily impose, but simply identify and shape a strong and unified word. What's important is what we do together, and in that respect, it brings me to maybe my second point, which is the diagnosis. I think, and then again, to put a long story short, I think what is really important is to really understand that in the Paris perspective, the strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, however you want to call it, is the result of the diagnosis that the world has changed, that the balance of force and the commitment of the different world powers to ensure the persistence, the pursuance of our international order and system has completely changed, and implies that the Europeans would have to be in the front line to ensure their own security. I think it's quite obvious in our southern neighborhood, and it's important probably to distinguish what we have to do in terms of neighborhood in the south and in the east, of course. But in the south, we've been seeing in Africa or in Middle East or everywhere that the main threats that we had to face in the past years have been threats that we had to deal with ourselves, and increasingly it will be the case. And we can discuss this maybe a little longer, but it doesn't mean, of course, that the situation is exactly the same in the East, and we don't. And this is something that I will touch upon on my third point. But just to finish on the second, that diagnosis on which I could add the different posture of the US, of course, the increasing influence and posture and assertiveness of China, and of course the enduring threats of the relation with Russia, all of which, of course, would call for Europe to really enter into the business of defining its own interest and develop the appropriate resources and be able to commit themselves, and all of which is, of course, the discussion that we're going to have today. But on this, I think it's important, and that would be the last consideration in my second point, and I'll try to be brief after that. It's important to be aware that it's a question of diagnosis, and it's not a question in reflex in Paris. I mean, it's important, and this is something that we recall very often in our own discussion in Paris, to show that it is reality that brings us to talk about strategic autonomy. It's not, once again, the idea that the French, in a neo-Gaullist fashion, would simply try to balance the different powers and superpowers just to find some space of their own to reinterpret the ground national independence. I mean, this is something completely different. It's not the question of having too many powers, just like during the Cold War, for example, or you have the US and you have Russia, and Europe is only trying to cope with the influence of these powers, which basically is the way the Gaullist way of thinking would see things. No, it's rather the opposite. It's not too many powers, it's too less powers, and that's why we need to step in and do some things that are not in the DNA of Europe as it's been built, but is more and more required by the circumstances. So, in a word, the last, which is the context. Of course, there is a new US administration right now, after a previous one that has done a lot for European strategic autonomy in a way, because it showed that it had no interest of taking over our own burden. But there is also China, there is also Russia and our southern neighborhood, and each of which require, of course, a different approach. And it's what strategic autonomy is about. There is not one answer to all the question. Acting alone is not the only principle that you can put forward when you speak about strategic autonomy. Of course, partnerships are important. Partnership with the US is still very important and necessary. But the question is, what are the Americans expecting from us? What are the other powers expecting from us? And how we can try to keep abreast of all of these challenges. Happy to discuss.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And now I give floor to Claudia Majore, and I ask everybody who would like to ask questions, please write them in a chat, and it will allow us to organize Q&A session in a more efficient way. So thank you very much, Gurvan, and now please, Claudia, floor is yours.
Thank you, Žaneta. And thank you, Gurvan, for the kind of setting the scene. First of all, I want to apologize that I have to leave earlier, but I know Jana, and Jana is probably one of the best voices you can get in Europe on sovereignty and autonomy. So I'm very confident that you will deal with all the questions I might not take. So I think woman power is in place here, and I'm very happy about it. It actually fits quite nicely with what we just heard from Paris. I want to make 3 points on strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, capacity to act, however you want to call the beast. The first, very briefly, because it has already been hinted upon, why it matters. The second, how we call it or how we define it. And the third, to go a bit down from the lofty concept, what could be criteria or baskets, to stay in the strategic compass language, to make sense of strategic autonomy or European sovereignty. So let's start with the first one. Why we talk about it. It's not new, has been around for a while. It's a buzzword. It's toxic. The French and the Germans remember the very useless exchange we had between the Président de la République Macron at the end of last year and the German Defense Minister AKK, where they actually managed to discuss things where they agreed, I would think, on about 90% of the content. So it seems to be a very interesting word that you can engage in so many debates about it. So why do we talk about it? If you look at the international security scene and we try to not talk about domestic power games, I would just take 4 reasons out of the many we have out. Very obvious reasons, but still very useful to remember. So why we talk about autonomy, sovereignty, things like that. The first is that defense and power politics have been back in Europe, at least since 2014. On the one hand, we have Russia's annexation of the Crimea, the war on Donbass in Syria, the intervention in hybrid scenarios. We have the whole kind of Russian thing, and we obviously also have in parallel terrorism and instability at Europe's southern border from Syria, Sahel, Libya, Yemen to Karabakh, which is destabilizing the continent. So we have defense power politics back from hybrid to conventional up to nuclear dimensions. The second is the ongoing shift in US priorities. Trump is history, at least for 4 years, luckily, but there are 2 things that will not change with a very friendly Biden administration. The first is the expectations for Europeans to do more. It's as old as NATO, so there's nothing new here on the horizon. And the second is that China as the leitmotif of US foreign policy is here to stay. China as a systemic change, the systemic rival, the main political, military and economic challenge. That also means that Europe, to a certain extent, is a strategic problem that needs less attention. And that also means that if we consider the current situation and we have an intensified strategic competition, we have a weakened norms-based international order, we have an increasing number of challenges to the US, including military. At the same time, in the US, we have domestic, economic, and political constraints, increasingly peer-capable adversaries of the US. If you take all that together, it simply means that Washington is unlikely to be willing and able to maintain the same commitment to stability in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa as it did in the past, which is, to be honest, not surprising. If they think China matters, then fair enough. That also means the pressure grows on us Europeans to do more. Third, we have a general questioning of the liberal order, which most Europeans value so greatly, and we have no indication what it's likely to follow. Or the indication what is likely to follow is rather unpleasant. And that is particularly the case for Germany, who so deeply cherishes the international system. We have key actors like Russia or China who redefine central components of the current order, seek to divide Europeans, put them under pressure, as we currently observe in France with the campaign against the French think tanker. Because I'm a think tanker, I'm particularly sensitive to that issue. The fourth development is that Europe is challenged from within. We have in many European countries, including my country, Eurosceptic and populist parties who rise partly into power and who weakens European political cohesion from within. To put it very bluntly and simply, for Germany, if Europe is not going well, Germany is not going well. So there's a big unease if the European cohesion and cooperation is not in a good shape. If you take those developments together, and there are others, it just shows that the pressure on Europeans to be better capable to put their act together is growing. And there is a bigger necessity and even urgency, and not really the choice to do more if Europe wants to find a place or a role in that order, the new order, and even to shape it. That brings me to my second point, sovereignty, autonomy, or how do we call the beast? I tend to agree very much with what Gurvan had said, that in the very core, it's about the ability for European states to set their own priorities, make their own decisions, have the means to implement those decisions with partners whenever possible, or without partners if they choose to do so. And that actually links perfectly to what I initially said. The apparently big debate between Paris and Berlin is not that big, actually. It's more about wording than about content. You can obviously concentrate on the little problems, but I think it's not really helpful. So it's not about rejecting alliances, I agree. Europeans will always be better off with partners, and particularly the US. That's a strong German conviction, which I insist to underline. But you can try to kind of figure out the role the Europeans need to play by putting it into questions. You could ask, and again refer to the example of the French think tanker, does Europe want to be an object in the competition, in the rivalry between China and the US, or does it want to play a role on its own? Does Europe want to subordinate to the roles set by others, or do we want to try and shape the environment according to our own priorities and values? Do we want to be a rule taker, or do we want to be a role maker? Those are big words. I'm very conscious about it. But in the end, these are the key questions. Autonomy is not a state. It's a gradual process where you can improve your capacity to act. So you can reach a higher degree of sovereignty or autonomy. It applies to all policy areas, and defense is certainly the one where it's the most difficult to achieve in Europe. And this is where we have the biggest dependency on the US. From a German point of view, there's no contradiction between stronger European commitment and strong transatlantic ties. They are considered to be mutually reinforcing. A stronger European capacity or stronger European capacities will strengthen the transatlantic ties. So this goes hand in hand. If we have stronger military contributions of all European allies, thanks to better cooperation on the European level, for example, the European Defence Fund or PESCO, if they are to deliver at some point, the overall European capacity to act will improve. And that will be a benefit for the EU, for European contributions and coalitions of the willing, the UN or NATO. But just to make that crystal clear, because it's also about difference between France and Germany. From a German point of view, currently there's no credible European defense without the US, full stop. And that's without the conventional, without the nuclear contributions of the US, without the political leadership, credible deterrence and the military defense cannot be guaranteed. So a little bit like the Baltic states, we consider NATO as our life insurance, which we are not willing to put into risk. So we have a little bit of kind of double approach. We have the reactive approach, saying we have to react to the changing global order, but there's also a kind of inherent driving force to say we have succeeded in building an amazing political framework in Europe with the European Union, and we are not able to protect it on our own. And about that, we should rather feel ashamed. So there is an intrinsic motivation and there is a reactive dimension. I think where we have a little difference with France is that Germany always considers itself being the advocate of the smaller countries and would always try to advance ideas in cooperation with other partners, with other countries. So speaking for Europe means for Germany always speak with Europe first, rather than being cavalier seul and advancing ideas on its own. So if Europeans were to be able to improve their capacities, to have a better capacity to act and to be a more attractive ally to the US, that also means that Europeans would be ready if ever the US decides to reduce its commitment to European security. That can happen on a temporary basis. For example, if the US resources are engaged in other theaters in the Pacific, if the US chooses not to be involved, as we have seen it with the previous administration under Trump in Syria 2019, or if it turns out that Biden was the exception and not Trump, and after 4 years, we are back into a toxic relationship with the US. Last point on that question of definitions. What we have observed over the last years in Europe was a battle of narratives. Who has the most fancy word for what we need to do? Strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, strategic responsibility, capacity to act. And we were very good in Europe to concentrate on this narrative, rather than focus that energy actually on implementation. And this is why I'm getting increasingly reluctant to define European sovereignty, because I think if you really want to understand it, but we should rather really work and move on to get something done. And that's my last point. How do we make practical sense of it? And I think if we want to move from the lofty concept to implementation, we need to focus on 4 dimensions. And here I refer mainly to a study I did with a wonderful Estonian and a wonderful Finnish colleague. I know the Estonian colleague is in this conference, on European sovereignty, which also shows that Central and Eastern Europeans are very much into the debate, and it's not a Franco-German one. So what are the 4 categories, the 4 dimensions we need to address when we want to implement strategic autonomy or European sovereignty? The first is a political dimension. That means Europeans need to define priorities and establish a vision for their activities. This implies to understand who is Europe. Is it the EU? Then we would like the UK. Is it NATO? Or are we rather going to focus on smaller formats? Who can provide leadership without the US? And the third aspect is, what is the level of ambition for Europeans? Is this crisis management or something else? I think we would probably look into smaller and directorial formats like the E3 to make sense of that leadership question. So the first is political autonomy. The second is institutional autonomy. What do I mean with that? It means that Europeans need to have the governance structures to implement and manage the priorities we have agreed upon. The EU has modest structures for crisis management. NATO is the biggest worldwide standing organization for defense, with functioning procedures, agreements, and structures. This includes nuclear deterrence. On the other hand, if the US were to be less engaged in European defense, we would probably need to think, how do we deal with those existing structures, in which one we would like to organize European defense? I'm a bit brief here, but otherwise I'm running out of time. So political autonomy, institutional autonomy, capabilities. It means to have the capabilities to implement the priorities set in our level of ambition. What can Europeans do already? There have been studies by the IISS and the German Council on Foreign Relations that currently the EU states are not able to fulfill the level of ambitions they defined at the European Union level, from the Helsinki headline goal up to the smaller scenarios, or even if you go back in history to the Petersburg task. There's also a study from IISS to what extent Europeans would be able to act in a limited regional conventional conflict in the Baltic Sea without the US. And it also showed the very limited capacities of the Europeans to address security problems on their own. Filling the conventional holes takes time. Redefining the nuclear role is even more complicated. While recent EU defense initiatives like PESCO or EDF are important, they have not yet delivered. So if we were really honest about filling conventional holes, we think in decades here, and we think about a lot of money. Last criteria, political autonomy, institutional autonomy, capabilities, is defense industry, the industrial strategic autonomy or sovereignty. The ability of European states to maintain expertise in strategic technologies, innovative next generation technology, and to secure a supply of defense material. Given that for many states, defense industry is not just an industry like chocolate, but is about national sovereignty, the consolidation of the European defense industry is not really making progress. In addition, defense projects take time. If I think about a Franco-German FAR project, or kind of one of the lighthouse projects, the Future Combat Air System, it was launched in 2017, and if it's ever going to fly, in brackets, it's not really going well in the moment, it would be in 2045. Not really tomorrow. So what do we make of it? I think the necessity to strengthen European capacity to act is beyond doubt. But in terms of political, financial, and timelines, it remains a major, major challenge. And even if the capacity to act were to grow from now on, we are still facing several years in front of us where we would not be capable to act as we would like to be. The conclusion is probably, again, what I said at the beginning, maybe we discuss a bit less and focus a bit more on the implementation. I still have 5 minutes, Žaneta, so I can take some questions because I was too long.
Thanks, Claudia. So there are 2 questions already in our chat box. And by the way, one is very much in line, which I wanted to ask. And it's about the leadership, to what extent, having in mind those numerous challenges EU is facing right now, and also those decisions and also implementational tasks, which you mentioned, Claudia, in your presentation, to what extent France and Germany could act as axis of leadership in those numerous endeavors and in numerous, let's say, actions which have to be taken.
I mean, it's an old secret that if you have France and Germany teaming up, you can make things move in Europe. In the same time, we also realize that only having France and Germany is not enough. You need other countries to team up with France and Germany. In the moment, in the bilateral Franco-German relationship, things are a little bit slow, to put it mildly. But you can always find positive examples. I would never have thought that France and Germany would be able to put the recovery fund in place. And that was really a milestone in European cooperation. If you look at the current situation, I would probably call for strategic patience, to stay with the buzzwords, and say, let's wait. We will have a new government in Germany. We have elections in Germany in September. We will form, I hope, rather quickly a new government afterwards, which might address those questions with new energy. And then we have in May 2022 in France elections. So we could have, if all goes well, in spring 2022, a revitalized Franco-German tandem team that could act as a kind of engine for Europe if both countries manage to talk with Europe instead of for Europe. That's extremely important. So if we manage to overcome our bilateral differences and then kind of team up with the other European countries, I'm rather confident.
Thank you. Probably, Gurvan, you wanted to react because Claudia also used your points.
Yes, most happy to react, of course. Agree a lot. Agree absolutely. I wouldn't change a word on that reaction. I would simply add maybe the fact that in a post-Brexit era, you need to look at the way the coalitions are rebuilding in Europe. It's completely different now to build a majority. We see also how countries have changed their own posture after London has gone. They want to play a different role, and it's simply the history of the complicated history of the European Council in the past decades has always been the same. It has changed. So it's simply to add on the idea that you cannot really do everything by only in Franco-German. Things are changing. And in other words, I mean, another note on the fact that the key question is the definition of the security interest throughout Europe. Everything that works is working on the basis of solidarity, which is very important. I mean, it's very important that out of solidarity, European countries would provide with some critical help on our intervention in the Sahel region, and helps us progressively move it to a more internationalized setup. And it's important that in return, we have a very high profile in the NATO operations in our frontier with the Russian sphere of influence. So all of this makes sense, but it doesn't answer the question of the definition of our common interest. And this is where you move from ability to act to willingness to act, like has been said in the comments. And a very last note to say that in a number of issues on which I think, because if you get into issues, concrete issues, health, defense, foreign policy, trade, the way we can affirm our economic interest outside Europe and fight against economic corruption and so on, all of these issues. I think we can, there is a broad agreement on where to move ahead with between Berlin and Paris. But on this, if you want to move forward, then you need to have the Commission on board. So you need to have the institutions. Institutions have been, in a way, in a number of issues, the first to really define strategic autonomy or something that looks like sovereignty, because the trade exclusive competence of the Commission is precisely a way to define common interest to and help us unite and prevent our strategic partners to play on our differences by creating some common interest, which is in a way what we are trying to achieve throughout European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. So it's important also to have the institution on board.
Thank you very much. I think now we have to let Claudia go with this. Thank you very much. And I hope, Claudia, that we will see you soon somewhere, either in a virtual space or probably in Riga in October during Riga conference. So thank you very much. And now Jana will have to take a lead on German perspective. Okay, thank you very much. And now I will pass floor to Yves, please.
Yes, thank you, Žaneta. Thank you, Nato, for the invitation to participate to this discussion. As a matter of principle, there is something rather singular in seeing the European Union stumbling over the notion of strategic autonomy, with the largest GDP in absolute terms. Europe that has irrigated the world with its culture, its science, its technology, its know-how, a continent rich of the talent of its population, with a glorious although tragic history, is still relying on others for its security and defense. Of course, in a world where globalization has created multiple interdependencies, this notion of autonomy has to be clearly defined and focus on the constituent of power in the 21st century. In my presentation, I will concentrate on the security and military dimension of autonomy in a rather concrete terms. But before that, talking about autonomy is not a dirty word, a taboo that should not be breached forever. Europe's strategic autonomy is not about opposition to the United States. It is the opposite of powerlessness. Behind this notion lies a debate reflected in two schools of thought, each promoting its vision for the future of the EU. The first school of thought considers that Europe should become more or less a sort of modern Hanseatic League, with security and defense issues being the sole domain of NATO, that is to say, under the patronage of the United States. Trade takes precedence over everything else. It presupposes healthy economies, a solid currency, and solving conflict through negotiation. Peace and tranquility are in a way procured by other means than military power. It is in a way the scheme of a kind of a great Switzerland on a European scale. The second school of thought considers, however, that the EU must exist by itself and be capable to evaluate what is going on the world stage and decide, if necessary, to act relying on its own capabilities and means, including military forces, which does not exclude action with allies. Strategic autonomy does not exclude alliance with the US. For the advocates of this vision, strategic autonomy is even more needed today under the pressure of the transformation of international scene, as mentioned by Gurvan and by Claudia. Global power games is back, and there is also the evolution of one of the essential parameters on which Europe has based its defense for decades, US foreign and defense policies. They may not be as predictable as EU's member states once believed. The Trump presidency was a warning, a clear sign of the profound transformation of US internal and external political landscape. Indeed, the Europeans can no longer expect Washington to see things their way, nor can they blindly follow Americans' lead, particularly when it comes to China and Russia. President Macron warned recently that the US and Europe joining together against China would create, I quote, the highest possible risk of conflict. To my understanding, the notion of autonomy promoted by Paris is based on past experiences. If during a crisis one does not have the means to take autonomous assessment of what is going on, one may find in a situation of dependence which alter understanding of reality and may be conducive to manipulation. And to be clear on that, regarding the French, we have witnessed that during the crisis against Iraq in the last 20 years. Autonomy is also a key to open fruitful cooperation on very sensitive issues with the Americans. The independent development of a nuclear arsenal by France bear witness of that. That's true again at the same time for space. Military space activities developed by the French have opened a considerable amount of discussion with the United States for fruitful results for both countries. Possessing strategic autonomy in the field of defense means also mastering and controlling complex technologies necessary not only to build sophisticated weapon systems, but also to be capable of assessing what other powers such as Russia and China are doing and capable in those fields. These current debates on strategic autonomy obviously have an impact on the EU's own dynamics. And I don't know if Mr. Lebras will share my perspective, but I would say that today there is a clear tension between Paris and Berlin over cooperation on armaments program, launched 4 years ago by Merkel and Macron. Programs supposed to be designed and built jointly, giving the two countries an additional degree of strategic autonomy. However, once reassured by the Biden administration on the presence of US forces in Germany, cooperation with France seemed to have lost its interest. Under this condition, few days after Joe Biden was elected, the German Minister of Defense, AKK, expressed vigorously a refusal to accept strategic autonomy, being called, I quote, an illusion. Incidentally, it was a blunder on the part of the German that the Minister of Defense answered directly to the President of the Republic. Should this be confirmed, this move by Berlin would be a lost bet for Emmanuel Macron. Clearly, this episode will leave scars at a moment where, before next year's presidential election in France, anti-European parties, political parties, are representing a significant part of the French opinion. Today, the debates on European strategic autonomy seem to have reached an impasse. The French proposal to go down this road has quickly become up against a whole series of obstacles. The fear in certain European countries of offending Washington, a vital ally against any Russian aggression, a NATO orthodoxy that is at the heart of almost all member countries when thinking security and defense, the absence of a vision about the ways and means for the EU to continue to exist on the international scene. As a conclusion, I will say that weakened by the Brexit, aging, fragmented on migration issues, often insufficiently innovative, generally running a trade deficit, rarely focused on geopolitical and strategic issues, the countries of the European Union run the risk of disappearing geopolitically. France remains, it seems to me, isolated in that matter. What does this mean in terms of defense for the French? Paris, scaled once again, will strengthen its nuclear arsenal, will improve its intelligence gathering system, notably the space component, will continue to provide its armed forces with strong expeditionary capabilities, and will continue to exercise on the high end of military action with the US, especially the US Navy and the US Air Force, as well as with the British in the framework of the Lancaster Treaty, leaving aside its EU's fellow partners and waiting for better days if they ever arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves. Adding some new components to our discussion from more general strategic autonomy issues related to security issues. You also added the nuclear deterrence, which is very important part of the discussion, and military capability as well. I think we will definitely come back to that. I'm also trying to follow the questions, and there are definitely a few which will expand on this topic. So now it's time for Jana, and you are one who is responsible for EU cohesion monitoring, and many experts are following those studies of ECFR. So how strategic autonomy looks from your perspective? Please, Jana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Žaneta, and it's fantastic to be at the Riga conference, albeit virtually, and I'm happy to see so many black squares with familiar white names on them, so happy to at least kind of read your names, if not being able to see all of you. Žaneta asked me to basically give a bit of a European sparkle to this debate, and I thought that images say more than words, and that's why I want to share my screen with you and share some of our recent findings with you. Basically, I want to share some slides. It's only 5, so don't worry, I won't keep you too long. 3 of them stem from a research that my colleague Ulrike Franke and Tara Warmer have done actually already back in 2019. And what they have done is they have sent a questionnaire to our 27 country researchers, back then still including basically the UK, so 28 country researchers, asking them about the notion of strategic autonomy in their countries. So one of the questions that they asked was, how does your country see European strategic autonomy in relation to NATO? You can see that the dark blue countries, including France, Germany, Italy, Spain, but also Finland, said both are basically perfectly compatible. The lighter blue countries, including Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, but also Latvia, said, so the relationship is compatible if Europe avoids delinking, duplication, and discrimination between their activities. Lithuania obviously saw this problematic because it would contribute to delinking, duplicating, and discriminating between the activities of NATO and the EU. And Estonia basically back then, or our researcher responded, it's unnecessary and damaging NATO. This is the next slide. Yeah, the other question we asked was, does Europe need greater solidarity on defense and security to move towards strategic autonomy? That basically is a question on Article 42.7 and Article 222, the mutual solidarity clause and the mutual assistance clause and the solidarity clause. And the question basically touches upon something that is, again, very relevant today, because this is one of the things that are debated in the strategic compass. So the yellow countries, including France, Italy, Spain, also again Finland, said yes, the EU needs to operationalize its defense and security treaty provisions. The light blue countries say, no, although this is a topic for the EU, the organization's treaty provisions are sufficient. And the dark blue countries say, no, this is not a topic for the EU, as NATO's Article 5 is sufficient. So, and the first one of these 3 slides was, how does your country see US concerns about European strategic autonomy? So the yellow countries said, serious as EU decision-making in the area needs to account for US concerns more often. So remember, this was in 2019, so that was during the Trump administration. Still, I'm wondering if these slides might now have changed, or the answers to that might have changed. And if we asked our researchers now, we would get a different answer, but I think the tendency is still the same and is pretty clear. So obviously, the countries bordering the eastern flank, maybe with the exception of Finland, say they are worried about the US concerns about European strategic autonomy. They see this as a threat. The green countries, including Germany, Spain, Portugal, and Austria, say, well, the US concerns were economically motivated, as strategic autonomy would strengthen Europe's defense industrial base. So it's only a question of defense industrial cooperation, basically. The light blue countries, including France and Italy, would say that they don't understand the US concerns about European strategic autonomy because strategic autonomy is the best way to answer US calls for greater burden sharing. And the dark blue countries said it's based on a misunderstanding that should be addressed through explanation. So these were 3 polls from July 2019, still under the Trump administration. I show you 2 more recent slides. So the first 3 slides are based on basically experts interviews that our associated researchers in all the EU member states have done with experts, with policy professionals, with policymakers. These next 2 slides are pretty recent ones from November 2020. And these are not expert opinions, but they basically capture the broader European population. So we did some polling with YouGov and asked in some European countries a lot of questions, among them the question, to what extent, if at all, do you think your country needs the security guarantee from the US to be safe from military invasion? And I point you to the fact that this obviously differs significantly within the European Union, with Poland being the outlier, and I think maybe closest to what the perception would be in the Baltic states. But I point you to France and Germany, where in both countries, people obviously think that it's not that necessary to have US security guarantees. I think for different reasons. In Germany, I think people are just not threatened. But this is the kind of political reality that politicians have to interact in our countries. This is also a very interesting finding, I think, because we asked people, what are the 3 most important countries for your country to have a good relationship with? And we asked about the US, Germany, France, China, UK, and Russia. And the kind of stunning result of this survey is the huge popularity of Germany. In many European countries, Germany basically took over from the United States, being the country where people think it's most important to have good relationship with. So this is just some numbers and some slides, because we do all these pollings all the time, so I thought they should be good for something, and I wanted to share them with you. And now, briefly, very briefly, I give you my kind of 5 key takeaways in bullet points. So obviously, the notion of strategic autonomy remains contested in the capitals way beyond France and Germany. And the concept, as we've just seen behind it, is still unclear. Some countries associate things with it that others don't. The sheer term autonomy, as was previously said, also by Gurvan, is very different in different national contexts. Second, the degree of engagement with the United States remains, I think, a key to understand why it is so different to basically get the Europeans going and get the Europeans enthusiastic about strategic autonomy. So the degree of engagement with the US is very different. And also the perception how sustainable the US engagement in Europe is and how desired the US presence in Europe is hugely different all over Europe. Third, that is not in the slides, but there was this economic aspect to strategic autonomy. So states vary greatly in their assessment of the relationship between market openness and basically partnerships. So how open should the EU defense market be to third countries? Very different views in Europe. Fourth, as we have seen, the degree to which Europeans support basically a bigger role for the EU also in territorial defense, in defending basically the European homeland, varies greatly in Europe. Some countries say this is a need, we need to talk about this. Others say that's only for NATO. Fifth, and this is my personal takeaway, I think there is an absolute necessity to talk about strategic autonomy and to have a broader approach to look beyond security and defense and also to other aspects like health, digital, climate, and the economy. However, I'm just afraid that Europeans are not aware that when they talk about digital sovereignty and economic sovereignty, climate sovereignty, that kind of if they are completely reliant for their own security on a country which they basically want to be able to hedge against in other areas, that this is a concept that this is not going to fly very well in the future. And with that, I leave it, and we have 3 minutes, I think, only for the discussion. I'm sorry for that.
Jana, don't worry, we have a little bit more time, so we could extend our discussion, since our initial arrangement was 2 speakers and we expanded more and more. So we have at least 20 minutes for the discussion. So, but there are so many questions that indeed we would need 1 more hour to go. But I would like to start the discussion, and then I will slowly go through those questions which are already written down in our chat box. But the discussion so far, and I'm not referring only to this present discussion, but more in general, in last at least 3 years about strategic autonomy, to a very large extent was driven by Trump administration. So if US is withdrawing from global affairs, we Europeans have to take more responsibility on our own and really to develop our capacity to act as unified actor. Now, with the new administration, there are certain hopes which are more normative, some kind of hopes, because we do not know exactly how the administration will form their policy making, what will be their foreign policy priorities, and also what's going to take place in the world. So how it looks, if, for instance, US is getting back its global political leadership role, is more engaging as a previous administration, what happens with European strategic autonomy? Will it fall apart? Will it loosen? Or Europe will keep the same pace? Because Claudia already mentioned PESCO and EFD. Of course, it's in its initial stage, but still the tendency is with a positive, let's say, dynamic. But what if Americans are back in game, back in Europe? What will happen with European initiatives? Because again, the pressure is there, economic pressure, public health pressure, and more and more and more. So what would be your reaction? What do you expect, at least in 3 years' time, what will happen with strategic autonomy? Who would like to start? Yves, probably you will start.
maybe a remark about this is about the centrality of the United States for many European countries. The US are our allies, good allies, provide a security net for the European, but why should we concentrate our vision of international relations exclusively on the US? We as Europeans shall not be limited to the European theater, to say in that way. We have other stakes. We have stakes about Africa, and as you and Estonia sent soldiers in Mali, in Sahel. We have big stakes in Africa. We have stakes elsewhere in Asia. So in terms of autonomy, that means that we have the absolute necessity to understand what is going on in this country. Of course, we have foreign affairs ministries that are scrutinizing this country, but we do need together to develop instruments to be able to assess what is going on in terms of crisis, in terms of conflict, if there are someone, in very different areas. And we need to do that in a European context, because it's about our future security. The second remarks I want to make, if you allow me, is that regarding the commitment on defense. The US is pressing the European to make commitment on defense. But what does that mean? Is it only a question to invest a little bit more of euros in defense and having the incapacity to send submarines in the sea, incapacity to have performing military units because they don't train, they don't have potent stock of ammunition to train, etc. So this is not about spending money. It's about, in a European context, developing potent conventional forces for the European theater or for elsewhere. And again, we come back to the idea that strategic autonomy is also about not limiting the EU to the European theater. I don't know if I was understood my plea not to concentrate only on Europe. We Europeans have to become a kind of world power and see everything at the world level in order to react, to act, to, well, okay.
Thank you very much, Yves. I would like to pick several questions which are already in the chat box. And one is from Andreas Kapstek, whom we know quite well. And he poses a very interesting question, being himself from UK. And he questions that at the present moment, UK is debating its new integrated review. It's UK's strategic ambition in the world. And the EU has its own strategic ambitions based on the sense of sovereignty. And the question he's asking, do you think that the UK and EU's respective pursuit of sovereignty or strategic autonomy will create a dynamic of greater global competition between the UK and the EU? So whether those UK and EU's sovereign global ambitions could create competition, or probably vice versa, adding also US global ambitions, become partners and create some kind of cooperative landscape on the global level. So what do you think? Yeah, Jana, please.
I think the question points to something that is very relevant right now, and that is also a huge threat. But I hope that the question basically will not materialize. But I think we can say with some certainty that in the UK currently there is little interest in institutional cooperation with the EU in so there is no appetite. The Johnson government, I think, has made it very clear that they don't see any advantage in seeking institutional links with the EU. They think global Britain does not need any formal framework. They can do this all in coalitions of the willing, bilaterally and through other frameworks. I think that, or I still hope that this is not the new norm in the UK's approach to the world, but I think we have to deal with it for now. I hope that in the long run, it becomes clear, as it has been during the negotiations for both sides, that nobody wins if basically the UK and the EU engage in a global competition and are not close partners. However, I think Brexit basically presents a huge challenge for the European Union, or especially in security and defense, poses a question to the EU. And that is, how much does the EU want to be kind of the center space for European defense and security? How much does it want to be the sideshow, or how much does it want to play only a supporting act? Because what we see with Brexit already is that coalitions of the willing, formats outside CSDP, outside NATO, kind of are gaining in importance. And this is something that could potentially undermine CSDP and the cohesion of the European Union. So I think it's really a question, what do we want to do with CSDP? Do we want to make it the main show? Do we want to make it the focus? And I think in order to do this, we need to find more attractive docking mechanisms to bring the UK, but also Norway into the game. I think strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy in the area of security and defense can only be achieved with the UK and with other non-EU Europeans, and not without them. But I think that's the crucial question for us here, because I think that EU member states will want to continue to work closely with the UK in different formats outside the EU framework on various topics. And so the question really is, how open or closed do we want the CSDP to be? And I personally would argue for a more open, more flexible approach towards working with third partners, including the UK, hoping that also in the UK kind of mindset will change again, and there will be a renewed interest in working with the EU as an institution.
Thank you, Jana. I wanted to switch our thinking in a little bit different direction, and the question posed by Klaus Wittmann was already more or less answered when we were debating US engagement in Europe. But here is a question from Nels Jansons, who asks, I think, very relevant question, which expands the landscape of the concept of strategic autonomy. And he writes that given the toxic nature of the term strategic autonomy, why do we need this grand concept or headline instead of pursuing the European interests in each policy area, digital, green energy, Indo-Pacific? We would avoid being misunderstood by the US, and we would avoid disappointment if the big lofty concept does not materialize. So I think this is a very important, question, having in mind of the European Commission's strategic foresight paper, which tries expand thinking of need of European strategic action, not only as far as CSDP is concerned, but more capacity to act is more at stake. So what do you think? To what extent Europe now is able to define its interests in so many areas? Who would like to take this question? Okay, please, Gurvan.
Thank you, Žaneta, for the question. Yeah, I think I completely agree with the premises of the question, which is that if it's toxic, then it's useless to ponder on it. Let's get directly to the matter, and I think that that's all the more important, since you can't really define what a more autonomous, what a more sovereign Europe would be in defense, in trade, in digital, in health, the same way. It's of course, it's completely different. It's completely different on which external theater you look at. It's obvious, for example, that the US security guarantee, the deterrence, is well, from today is completely necessary to Europe. I mean, if there was the slightest notion that this would be in a way compromised, and that's why the Trump era has been a trauma for many European countries. If there was a notion that security guarantee would be compromised, then most probably it would have consequences the morning after on our security, because of attempts to compromise our security. So there should be no doubt about it. But on that, the objective must be, and I mean, if you want to simply try to assess what burden sharing is, I think you can also refer to Antony's Blinken speech to the ministers in the previous council, and a number of public statements he made also. That's a strong Europe able to define its own interests. So it's not just about just like Yves said about building, simply contributing financially. It's about building your own capacity, your own assessment, and your own willingness to act. So each and every field will require different commitments. If you take digital, for example, digital and trade, then suddenly you have a definition of what you have to do in terms of defining the European interest that will lead you to a different conception of your relation to the United States. Because in digital, do they really see us as a partner? Do they see us as a competitor in trade? Do we need to envisage the development of our capacity in terms of complementarities with the US? Probably not, rather competing with what they do and making sure that we have on our grounds the critical technological edges and critical capacities, emerging technologies that will shape the competition of tomorrow in a number of issues. So it's going to be different. In health, it's going to be different as well, because it's a world issue. It is common goods, health, epidemic preparedness, and so on. So it's another story again. So words matter in a way, of course, as always in diplomacy, but actions is much more important. So I can only agree with that, of course.
Yeah, thank you, Gurvan. I wanted to switch our thinking towards another question, which was asked by Kurt Engelen, and he is quite critical about ability of EU member states to invest more in defense, and whoever asks Europeans to contribute more to their capabilities, most probably it will not reach an open air. But he asks that the real European problem it's defense industry, and defense industry is part of member state economies, and therefore the question is, shouldn't we more think in terms of economic autonomy rather than operational autonomy? Who would like to respond to that question? Yves? Okay, please.
Yes, the two are not contradictory. I mean, to have potent military forces, you have at least to possess the industrial capabilities, the defense industrial and technological base for development of weapons, and this is of paramount importance. And the second issue is if you have military forces, you have to invest in a lot in training. And unfortunately, in many European countries, there is and insufficient investment in training. We have a lot of forces in Europe which are forces which basically remain in their caserne. They are not trained sufficiently in a hard manner. This is good. This is nice to talk about defense security right now in peacetime, but when crises erupt, you need to have on the spot potent forces. And unfortunately, despite the increase in spending, there is not enough effort from the European to possess hard-trained military forces. So we have to develop both industrial and technological base for defense, which suppose potent industries, and at the same time we have to also invest in what constitute real and potent military forces, because it's a shame that in many countries we have, let's say, the example of submarines. I mentioned that, and in many European countries you have submarines. Unfortunately, they remain at quay in their port because there is not enough people trained to man the submarines. There are not enough qualification to send the submarine patrolling. So there is a huge effort which go beyond commitment to NATO to increase defense. We have to make ourselves more aware of the real state of armed forces. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to pick from those numerous questions one I think very relevant so far, being left outside of our discussion. Question asked by Latvian former ambassador in France and also NATO, Yves, and he asks, does the French initiative, practical-oriented European intervention initiative, which falls outside the EU, form a crucial part of strategic autonomy? How is its development currently being viewed in Paris and Berlin? So probably, Jana, how this intervention initiative, European intervention initiative, is seen in Berlin, and then probably either Gurvan or Yves could respond on French side. Let's start with Jana, please.
Well, I think I don't reveal a secret saying that the Germans did not exactly love the idea of the European Intervention Initiative in the very beginning. And I think a lot of French researchers basically told me that there is a suspicion also in France that Germany then joined as a Trojan horse to prevent the worst. I don't know if that is true, but there is a structural problems that Europeans have, not only with the European Intervention Initiative, but with all sorts of frameworks outside an EU and NATO framework. Basically, there are two things. The first is that you would hear very often in Germany that it is counterproductive to create new formats and institutions at a time when basically the established institutions are under so much pressure. So, and there is very often perceived kind of a threat that these ad hoc coalitions or new groupings could undermine the cohesion in the EU and also in NATO. So that is one of the reasons, but the other is far more concrete. So when it comes to military missions, for example, operations, it is crucial for the Germans to have a framework of collective security in order to be able to participate and to send soldiers. This is due to a ruling of our Federal Court of Justice dating back to the year 94. And I have had many encounters, for example, in Berlin when we debated a European mission to the Strait of Hormuz, and the Germans insisted on an EU framework. AKK, our defense minister, even brought Article 44 of the EU treaties in the discussion to make that possible, because for kind of the Germans, it is just not possible to participate in a French-led ad hoc military mission. We've seen this with Takuba, we've seen this with the Strait of Hormuz question. And in Germany, there is no willingness from politicians, no willingness at all to address this topic and to debate this. To the contrary, I think a lot of politicians hide behind this kind of excuse that German participation is not possible. But yeah, that is a problem which the Germans have with this, with these initiatives popping up increasingly all over Europe. And that's why I think Germany put so much emphasis on making the EU framework and CSDP, the CSDP kind of the focus of attention again, and want to work now also in the framework of the strategic compass to find ways to make CSDP missions and operations more flexible, more robust, more agile. Because, yeah, we simply need an UN, NATO, or EU framework, and we have this. I mean, there are exceptions. We participated in coalitions of the willing, but it's just a damn difficult topic for us, and that's why, yeah, we have problems.
Thank you. And Yves, please, you from French side.
Yeah, very briefly, regarding out of area intervention. Well, in a way, it's fortunate and it's a pity at the same time that for the French, the two countries with whom we can participate to outside intervention are the United States and Britain. Britain, in the framework of the bilateral Lancaster Treaty, where both countries, the UK and France, create the combined joint expeditionary force. And this is a force which is planned for intervention everywhere in the world, if I may say so. So that's a pity. That's a pity because regarding those kind of intervention, there is no European countries, either because the countries lack the means or lack the political will. And in that way, Germany is unfortunately a very good example. Lack of will and lack of capabilities. I am sorry, I am not diplomat like Gurvan, so I can say things straightforward.
Yeah, thank you, Yves. This is the reason why we always like to mix diplomats with experts. So it usually gives the best combination for the discussion. Unfortunately, we are slowly running out of time. And it looks that the more or less the joint feeling and atmosphere among all of us is that strategic autonomy is a buzzword which allows almost everybody, either on member states or on expert levels, to include in this wording whatever context or connotation he or she or institution would like to put it in, creating definitely kind of confusion, more and more confusion on the table. But on the other hand, so these discussions still create a very good platform for compromising ideas, compromising views, searching for best possible scenarios or at least preconditions for improving or strengthening EU's cohesion. Discussion definitely is not over because there are so many issues and so many questions pending. But wrapping the discussion up, during the Riga Conference 2021 in October this year, there definitely will be a panel on strategic autonomy. Which would be your offer for the discussion? What is, from your point of view, the most urgent issue to be addressed in order to reach Europeans' capacity to act? So probably, Jana, you could start.
Yeah, because I want to follow up on what I just said. I think it is really crucial also to change maybe the German thinking on this a little bit, and maybe also to, but no, start differently, to increase the awareness of the German problem in other regions in Europe, I think is crucial. And I think we need to find a new kind of working relationship between these coalitions of the willing and other formats and the EU framework. And I think we should work on bringing them closely together. That doesn't mean to integrate them into the EU framework. I know that that this was originally kind of always a German idea, but if that is not possible, I think the European Intervention Initiative harms nobody and is very beneficial in many ways. So let's put a lot of ideas into how to link, for example, Takuba closely to UTM Mali, and to bring the different formats together in a way that European security is strengthened, because I think it's a luxury to discuss this in pillars, kind of this is the EU pillar and this is that pillar and this is the NATO pillar, because I think we cannot afford this luxury. We have to have an all hands on deck approach. And I think talking about strategic autonomy, the real question is really, are we talking about EU strategic autonomy or European strategic autonomy? How to bring partners on board, how to make it more flexible, how to bring the UK on board, how to link that with coalitions of the willing, and how to make this kind of really a consistent approach that we have. So this would be my take.
Okay, thank you. Gurvan, what would be your?
Well, complicated question, but I think in terms of agenda, most probably there you will be faced with the way we are drawing lessons from the way Europe has been dealing with the pandemics, and therefore opening maybe a new horizon for a European competence in terms of health. And same issue, economic recovery inside Europe and also outside. That is European contribution to the world recovery, and that's the very important question of solidarity. That's a European issue as well. And probably I would say also digital. We've been able to secure our European vision and a European way forward in terms of coalition with the US, especially when it comes to the relation with China as well. We will be able to secure a world agenda with the US and China on digital, on trade, and some issues. That would be another issue I would probably see important. And last, climate, because we will be on the COP26, and there needs to be European and American leadership in terms of ambition, I think.
Thank you. Yves, and what would be your take?
No, it's a very rather limited remark about what Jana just said about the condition for German participation to out-of-area intervention. And Jana mentioned the need to make Takuba and EU in Mali closer together. That's a nice idea, but it will raise a lot of questions, particularly for the German political leadership. Because if you get close Takuba and EU mission in Mali, you will raise a lot of hidden problems. Let me be very concrete on that. What will be the reaction in the Bundestag if there is such rapprochement? And when, here I will be very concrete. If German soldiers participate to fight with Chadian soldiers, as the Chadian are, we know that, they don't make prisoners, they kill them. What will be the reaction of the German politician in the Bundestag if the German soldier participate to such fight where you don't make prisoners, you kill them? In France, we have a particular political system with a Republican monarch, which avoid complication about those sensitive issues. But for other countries in a European context, these are real issues, concrete issues that we have to discuss all together. How the German political system is able to accept German intervention elsewhere on an ad hoc basis, not in a EU framework, not in a NATO framework, but on an ad hoc basis.
Thank you.
Just maybe on just sorry.
Very quick, 1 minute response.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. It's impolite to jump in, but I'm not sure you can really say that it's zero problem in France if you have French soldiers associated with Chadian killing prisoners. I don't think so.
Okay, Jana, you wish to say something?
Yeah, well, I agree that the Germans need to become more flexible because. But I mean, I think we need to address these questions because otherwise you will have these work share forever in Europe. So the French do kind of the dirty, hard jobs and kill the terrorists, and the Germans train and equip. If you want that, I think the Germans would be happy to accept this. The German population out there would be super happy to be a big Switzerland. But I think this whole idea was about making a kind of Germany participate more in these kind of activities. And so you can make it impossible for Germans to do that. And then you create more coalitions of the willing, because then it's just easy for the Germans to say no. I've heard so many politicians say, oh yeah, but Strait of Hormuz set by the French is impossible. They should have asked us. It's not in compliance with our constitution. So you can make it easy, or you can make it difficult for the Germans to say no. And I would just urge you to make it more difficult.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for very lively and very interesting, particularly very interesting last part of our discussion, which reminds us that Europe is a very complicated creature, which consists of member state interests and European interests. And most probably, Europe will reach its highest level of strategic autonomy when those national interests will be able at least to meet each other more and more often in different areas, not only either in economy or defense or security, but when it will be done across all sectors. So therefore, I would like to end on an optimistic note. An optimistic note will be that the buzzword will be still there. But the pessimistic note of the end of the conversation is that still we will have to go a very long way ahead of us, at least to reach a higher level of coherence, which will allow us to be autonomous on international level. Thank you very much for this discussion, and hope to see you all in October during the Riga conference and continue our discussion. Thank you, Yves, thank you, Gurvan, thank you, Jana, and thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Latvian, for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye.